Will 2024 be the closest presidential election in history? This is a question that Harry Enten asked on CNN recently.
We talk about a historically close race. Oftentimes we talk about the national polling, but I wanted to try and dig into the state numbers to get an understanding of how close this race is. Holy cow, from a historical perspective. So what I did for all of the years going back since 1972 was I took a look at the final polls, and then I basically calculated out what the electoral map would look like and how high up would the leading candidate's electoral vote total get. And what we essentially see is right now the leader's electoral vote total is 276 electoral votes based upon the polls. If you go back since 72 and try and find the closest years, if you go back to 2000, which of course was a historically close election, at the end of the campaign, the poll leader's electoral vote total was just 281 electoral votes. That's where Gore was in the final polls of that campaign. You go back to 2004, George W. Bush was at 296 electoral votes. So based upon the polls at this point, we are heading into the election with the closest polls in the Electoral College that we have ever seen, at least over the last 50 years. It's stuff like this that gets me up in the morning. It gets me truly excited as a political sort of scientist.
So for context, Bush in 2000 won 271 electoral votes. It's about as close as you can get. And actually, if you zoom in even more, it was even closer. For those of us who are old enough to remember it, it really came down to 537 votes in Florida. You know, I'm not talking about delegates. I'm not talking about counties. I'm talking about 537 actual people in Florida decided this election. It may have been even fewer, but the Supreme Court intervened to stop the counting in that race. Now, my theory here is, and it seems like Harry Enten agrees, is that how could it be even closer than 537 votes? Well, you could have a few Floridas this time around. So a few states that come down to a few hundred or a few thousand votes. Here's what the polling averages in the New York Times as of this recording say. So right now, Michigan has Harris with a slight lead, fewer than 1%. North Carolina, Trump, less than 1%. Pennsylvania, Harris, less than 1%. Nevada, less than 1%. Wisconsin, Harris, less than 1%. And then Georgia and Arizona, both with Trump, with about a +2 in the polling averages. These are really tight margins. And in the past elections, whether it was 2020 or 2016, we've seen polling errors that go in either direction that are well within the margins that we're seeing right now. In 2020, just 44,000 votes separated Biden and Trump in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. So a question you need to ask yourself as you head into this race, and I know a lot of people who have a lot of sort of anxiety about this race are saying, well, what's similar or different this time around than 2020? Is this better for my candidate than in 2020, or is it worse for my candidate than in 2020? So let me break it down for you. On this Trump side of things, where is Trump doing better right now? And the sort of favorables are better for Trump today than they were in 2020. Well, number one, he's facing a semi-incumbent in Harris, who is, despite her best efforts, trying to, she's tethered to the Biden record in some way because she's the current vice president. Now, Biden is currently sitting at 40% approval, 54% disapproval. He has unpopular positions on the economy, Israel and Gaza, immigration. You can keep going. And this is reflected in the wrong track, right track numbers. Like the overwhelming amount of the electorate of plurality is saying that we are on the wrong track right now. And Trump is viewed much more favorably today than when he left office. He still doesn't have a great favorable rating, to be clear, but he has a 43.4 favorable today in the averages of his favorability compared to 38.6% at the beginning of the Biden administration. That's kind of the low water mark for Trump because that was right after January 6th, which I'll come back to. Trump was at 45% in November 2020. So, about a 1.5 better than he's doing today. Trump also has been getting his people to embrace the early vote. We've done a bunch of videos and podcasts about that already. The numbers so far seem to suggest that Trump's people are turning out earlier in this election than they did when he discouraged them in 2020. That will help his field team, in the final stretch, in the final days of the election, focus on fewer doors, getting out fewer people, and also it's just a sign of potentially of enthusiasm amongst his base. And of course, Trump is polling much better today than he was against Biden or against Hillary Clinton. In both those cases, he was pretty significantly down heading into the final stretch of the election. He's basically neck and neck with Harris right now. So those are the positives for Trump. On the positive sides for Harris, what is different today than in 2020? Well, Harris is different, so you could start there. Some people view that as a positive. Some people view that as a negative. I'll show you some data in a second, or talk about some data that kind of helps tilt that debate in one direction or the other. But most importantly, Dobbs is different, right? Why did Democrats overperform in 2022? Namely because of Dobbs, right? The post-Roe environment has really animated a significant sector of the Democratic base and potentially added suburban white voters, white female voters, to the Democratic coalition, and also obviously added enthusiasm to the coalition. You also had January 6th, right? Remember the 2020 election happened in November 2020. January 6, 2021 obviously has been on the minds of a lot of voters. That showed up in some of the exit polls in 2022. So if you look at the 2022 exit polls, Dobbs and January 6th showed up pretty significantly there. One other overlooked area that Harris is better at today than Biden was in 2020 is actually ground game. I think a lot of people forgot about this, but back in 2020, you had COVID, and actually the Democratic coalition wasn't really knocking doors and running a field campaign for a significant percentage of that campaign, and actually Trump's team was. And this was largely because of the way that Democrats took certain precautions and were more conservative as it relates to COVID, whereas the more Republican-leaning candidates were, I think, a little bit more risk-friendly and felt like the world needed to open up faster, and actually were running more traditional ground game campaigns earlier in that campaign cycle. So you got to imagine that Harris has a better ground game this time than last time around. Trump is actually also less popular by a hair than he was in 2020. Talked about that. Polls have adjusted to account, allegedly, for the 2020 errors. This is at least what the pollsters are saying. So although the polls are not as good for Harris right now, maybe the polling is more accurate this time around. This is more of a qualitative piece here. It's just my opinion. But Trump also appears much more unhinged on the trail this time than he was in 2020. Obviously you have things like eating cats and dogs. Just, this couple days ago, he was talking about Arnold Palmer's penis size. He, the week before, was talking about using the military to go after his domestic enemies. These are, even by Trump standards, more extreme, weird statements than he was making around this time in 2020. You also have a younger electorate just by the nature of how demographics shift in this country, and the numbers have been shifting back in Harris's direction in terms of the young vote. So the CNBC Generation Lab poll was just released today, showing that Harris has about 60% of the voters age 18 to 34 compared to 40% for Trump. When that question was asked in July, Harris only had a 46% share of that age group against 34% for Trump. Biden was completely underwater. Actually, Trump was doing better with young voters at various points, believe it or not, than Biden was. And then finally, and I don't think this matters that much, but Vance is less popular than Mike Pence was. So Pence's favorable was 41% in August 2020. It was actually much better in 2016. So that's 41% versus 37%, which is the average favorable for Vance right now. Walz is performing roughly where Pence was, so at 41.4%. So the sort of vice presidential nominee for the Democrats is more popular than the Republican vice presidential nominee, and the last Republican vice presidential nominee in Pence, the vice president, was more popular than Vance as well. Do I think the vice president is going to matter that much? Probably not. So those are the sort of different trends that are going in one direction or the other for each candidate relative to 2020. But there's actually a whole lot about this race that feels very similar to 2020. Number one is that Harris is viewed more favorably than Trump. So 46.6% Harris favorability versus 43.4% favorability. Biden was also more favorably viewed than Trump by similar margins. Hillary was also way more favorably viewed than Trump. It was 43 versus 34, 9-point gap in favorability. So the question is, how much does favorability matter? Well, maybe that's what put Biden over the top in 2020, although it's hard to explain Hillary's 2016 favorabilities. Maybe some of the October surprise Comey stuff played a part in that. Money. So Biden's campaign dramatically outraised and outspent Trump's campaign, about 1.5 to 1 in direct campaign spending and 2-to-1 in political action committee spending. The race is roughly shaping up the same here. Harris has outraised Trump. So if you look at just the October numbers, so the campaign has just released the money that they have heading towards the final stretch. Harris is heading into October with $187.5 million cash on hand, compared to 119 million cash on hand for Trump. So similar 1.5 to 1 ratio. When you factor in the PAC spending, Harris and her affiliated groups have about $348 million on hand, whereas Trump's affiliated groups have $283 million on hand. So it roughly shakes up the same. Harris's team also has about 30% more ad reservations in the final 2 weeks of the campaign, according to Ad Impact. Now, more spending doesn't always equal better campaign. In some cases, it's obviously not. And in some cases, there are some reasons to be a little worried about some of the spending on the Democratic side. A good example is if you just look at the RNC versus DNC spending. The DNC spending has a much larger head count, twice as many people, but not as much money on hand as the Republicans. So one could imagine if they wanted to, they could unload their money into ads or anything else, whereas Democrats have a lot of people on their staff. In a lot of cases, Democratic campaigns and organizations are unionized, so there are more restrictions on how people work, et cetera. So I'm not sure I would make too much out of the money difference right now, but I think on balance, what all of this says is there are a lot of comparison points to 2020, but this is a much different race. I actually think in many ways, despite how close 2020 is, I actually think this one could be a lot closer, which means that this could stretch even further beyond Election Day, especially given all the shenanigans around, poll watchers, election watchers, changes to state law, et cetera. So we could be in for an even more dramatic post-election period than we had just 4 years ago.